Good morning, boys and girls. Welcome back to school. Today, we're going to get started as planned with our big lesson on World War I. It's going to start in 1914. The fighting is going to end in 1919, and the war inevitably will finally end with the peace treaty in 1920. We're not going to mention Adolf Hitler. We're not going to mention Pearl Harbor and other things that are associated with World War II over the next couple days. World War I is a lesson that you don't know too much about. You know a lot more about World War II, and over the next couple of days, really lock in so we can learn a lot about this first great war in our world. Now, one difference between World War I and World War II is that World War I was predominantly fought in Europe on two fronts, and World War II was fought all over the world. Now, let's get started. First off, let's talk about the causes. Now, for the last couple of weeks, we've been trying to start this war, and indirectly, we've been getting after trying to start World War I. Now, the war almost starts before 1914. It almost starts in 1899, and almost starts in 1907 to the point where countries had to come together and have peace talks in a place called The Hague. Now, The Hague is in the Netherlands, where the World Court is today, where if someone were to get in trouble and cause many countries trouble, like an Osama bin Laden or someone like that, then they would be tried at the World Court in The Hague. Now, there are four main causes of World War I. We've already talked about two of them. The first one is imperialism. Now, if you recall, imperialism was when countries all over the world in Europe would travel all over the world and take out places outright. They would colonize them and they would just dominate other nations. Now, that almost will start World War I, and here's an example. The war is almost going to start in 1905, and it's almost going to start in 1911, between Germany getting ready to fight Spain and France over a small country in northwest Africa called Morocco. Germany thought it had claimed it during the age of imperialism. Spain and France thought they had claimed it, and they almost go to war over little Morocco. In fact, there were French battleships, there were German ships, naval ships in the Mediterranean Sea getting ready to fight the war. And that's why imperialism is going to be inevitably a major cause of World War I. Now, one example that we haven't talked about is militarism. Now, militarism is the building up of a country's war forces. In Europe and around the world, for years now, factories have begun placing or replacing clothing and furniture with building up weapons in anticipation of, quite frankly, a war happening someday. Now, the weapon that is going to be the most dominating, the most feared weapon of World War I is going to be the machine gun. World War I battlefields are where the machine gun is going to first make its claim. Now, poison gas, such as mustard gas, as you can see on the slide, is going to make its debut during World War I. We're going to have a bunch of different grenades that you see on there in World War I. There are flamethrowers in World War I. And if you look closely at the image of the mortar, you can see a cylindrical tube where you would put a shell into the top of it. It would slide down to the bottom, and at the bottom of the tube, there would be an igniter, and it would ignite, and it would push back up out the top of the tube and land on the opposing side of your opponent, right? It could be 30 yards, it could be 40 yards, it could be 50 yards, maybe longer than that. And remember, 50 yards is the distance of a football field. Now, the first battleship on Earth was made by the British, and it happened to be called the Dreadnought. And you can see, for you Navy fans in the crowd, the ship right there in the image. Now, I have a quick question for you. We need to figure out what country had more of this stuff at the start of World War I. Now, the country that you're thinking about is going to be the one that it's going to experience the most industrial growth in this time. Does anybody have an idea? Do you give up? Well, it was Germany. The fastest growing industrial and populated country in the world from 1880 to 1913 was Germany. Hint, hint. They had more of this stuff than anybody on Earth. It was the fastest growing industrial and populated country in the world from 1880 to 1913. So they were producing this stuff at a much higher and a much quicker rate than any of the countries of the world. Now, the next cause of World War I is nationalism. Now, nationalism, as you remember, is patriotism. It's an intense love of one's country. Now, here was the problem in Europe in 1914. The problem was that even though, and you learned about this in your homework not too long ago, there were countries that were becoming unified, like Italy, like Germany, and so on. There were still countries in Eastern Europe that were made up of a bunch of ethnic groups but did not have a territory, that did not have their sovereignty. Now I want you to look at this image on this slide, and I want you to look at all the purple little circles there. Now those purple little circles represent ethnic groups. For example, you can see one group there is called the Poles. Well, today, they live in Poland. The Poles, in 1914, did not have a country. Going north of where you see the Poles, you can see the Lithuanians, the Latvians, the Estonians. Those were all ethnic groups in 1914. Well, those ethnic groups today now live in their countries. Estonians live in Estonia, Latvians live in Latvia, Lithuanians live in Lithuania, and so on. But in 1914, they were all ethnic groups, and they were all being ruled by a bigger power. Now, if you can see the Austro-Hungarian territory, where Austria-Hungary is, you can see it is a huge, huge territory, and in that huge territory, there are a lot of those purple circles. There are a lot of ethnic groups that lived in Austria-Hungary that, like the Croats, like the Serbs, like the Romanians, that did not have their territory. Now, that area that is just north of Greece, where you can see the Albanians and the Bulgarians and the Serbs and the Romanians and the Croats, that area, write this down, is called the Balkans, B-A-L-K-A-N-S. And they were actually had a nickname, this area of the world, called the Balkans. It was called the powder keg of Europe, just like a gunpowder keg. If you were to light up a barrel of gunpowder, it's going to explode. And hint, hint, this area of the world, if anything were to ever happen in this area of the world, that whole area would ignite into war. Now, the ethnic groups that I'm referring to in purple all belong to a bigger group of people, and they were called the Slavs. Now, today, they're still called the Slavs. And today, they are still pretty much protected of the largest, or by the largest Slavic country in the world. And that Slavic country is Russia. And Russia was the big brother to all of these ethnic groups. And if there was ever a time when little brother was disturbed by anyone in the region, well then big brother was going to come to their aid. That's called pan-Slavism. All of the ethnic groups were under indirect, and in some cases direct, Russian rule. Russia served as the big brother to many of these little ethnic groups. Now, the last example of, or last cause of World War I is alliances. Do not write all of these down. You can take a screenshot of it and you can add it to the notes, which you should be writing down at this point. Now, the last major alliance that we talked about in Europe was called the Quadruple Alliance. And remember, it started in 1815 after Napoleon was defeated. Well, look, starting in 1879, how countries started to team up with each other. And remember my example. If you messed with one of us, you messed with all of us. You can see in 1879 that Germany and Austria-Hungary are going to join forces. You can see in 1881 the Three Emperors League. And you can go on, and you can look at this, how Russia's going to get involved, how Russia's going to back out. You can see the British and the Japanese in column number 2. You can see France and Russia and Italy. You can see secret little alliances being formed. This whole slide's theme is paranoia. These countries were paranoid. They knew that they were going to go to war, and they needed friends. They needed buddies. And that's why alliances are going to be a major cause of World War I. Now, at this point, we have talked about the 4 major causes of World War I. But as you know, all great events in history have to have a spark. They have to have an immediate cause. They have to have the storming of the Bastille. They have to have the battles of Lexington and Concord. And World War I's main immediate cause, or the immediate cause, is very memorable. It's a very famous assassination. Now, The immediate cause of World War I is the assassination of the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, a guy named Franz Ferdinand, and his wife, Sophie. Now, they were the leaders of Austria-Hungary, and in June of 1914, they decided to ride down south into Sarajevo. Today, Sarajevo is the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Well, back then, it was part of Austria-Hungarian territory. And remember, in that territory, there were a bunch of ethnic groups. So here come the Archduke and his wife. They're coming down to Sarajevo just to check up on the folks down south. They were going through, making sure that relationships were good and so on. Now, on June 28, 1914, they decided to take a parade down Main Street, Sarajevo. And it's just like a president of the United States would. It's just like the Pope would. When they go to cities, they take parades downtown and so on. Today, those vehicles are covered up with bulletproof glass and so on. Well, back in those days, they were pulled by horses, and you can see in the images on my slide right here that it was an open cart. Well, what happened was, early on that day, they were riding down downtown Sarajevo, and out of the crowd comes a bomb that was thrown at their motorcade. So imagine a bunch of cars in a line, and it missed the Archduke and his wife's car, but it hit a little cart ahead of them, to the point where those people who were Austria-Hungarian officials and friends of the Archduke and his wife Sophie, they had to go to the hospital. So they got the Archduke out of there quickly. They got him out of there, they got Sophie out of there, they went back to their hotel. Well, later on that day, they took the same route, right downtown Sarajevo, to go visit their buddies in the hospital to see how they were. Well, this time, out of the crowd comes this teenage kid named Gavrilo Princip, which you can see on my slide. He has a little handgun, and he steps to their car, and he kills the Archduke, and he kills his wife. Well, it later came out that he was a member of a terrorist organization called the Black Hand. This was a Serbian group, and on June 28, 1914, the Serbians were said to have armed this terrorist organization called the Black Hand that made this Gavrilo Princip murder the Archduke and wife of Austria-Hungary, Franz Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie. Now, this is a huge deal, and this is going to be the immediate cause of World War I. Now, you would think that Austria-Hungary would declare war on Serbia right away, but it didn't happen. If you look at a map real quick, and you look in your map of 1914 of Europe, you can see Austria-Hungary on the map, and you can see little Serbia on the map. And they did not go to war right away. The reason why they're not going to go to war right away is because the world would have a big problem with that. Look at the size of Austria-Hungary. Look at the size of Serbia. In those days, in 1914, Austria-Hungary was almost 10 times the size of Serbia. And the world would have a real big problem. It's just a basic rule of fighting. You don't mess with somebody that's smaller than you. So the war is not going to start right then and there after this assassination, which was the immediate cause of World War I. Now, tomorrow, when we go through our lesson, we're going to start with a very, very famous ultimatum, and then we're going to see how World War I checked out. Now, go to Shobi, and you're going to have instructions on watching a live video on the assassination of the Archduke and his wife that is going to start World War I.